How would any father feel if his daughter was murdered?
What can they do to try and bring this man out, to draw this rat out of his hole, because he must be hiding somewhere.
28-year-old Tatsuya Ichihashi was hiding. For nearly 3 years, he traveled hundreds of miles over Japan, cowered behind a dead man's identification, lived in abandoned buildings on remote islands, and mutilated his own body with box cutters in multiple twisted attempts to hide his own identity. All because of the horrific crime he committed in March of 2007. The cherry blossoms bloomed early in the spring of 2007. It was 22-year-old Lindsay Hawker's first Sakura season in Japan, and she had every intention of enjoying it to the fullest. The bright, outgoing English teacher was thrilled to be in Japan. She had grown up in Coventry, England, and graduated in 2006 with a degree in biology from the University of Leeds. In college, she flourished, making countless friends and graduating with honors, despite the challenging curriculum. Lindsay planned on getting her master's degree eventually, but after years of being locked down studying in the UK, she was craving a change. There was a whole world out there to see, and Lindsay wanted to experience it before she settled into her long-term career. As soon as she decided to teach English outside of the UK, she had her eyes set on Japan. She was drawn to the country's beauty, cultural intricacies, and safety. With low crime rates, it seemed like the perfect place for a young woman to travel alone. Little did Lindsay know that soon she would become the victim of one of the country's most publicized homicides in history.
As a father, I am so proud of her. To travel all this way to teach. I miss her so.
On March 20th, 2007, Lindsay finished teaching English at Nova, an English conversational school in Korea, and took the train home to Chiba, where she resided with 2 other international students. As she unchained her bike, a man nervously approached her. Lindsay gave him a polite nod. But what he did next puzzled her. He blurted out that he was one of her students, though Lindsay knew this was a lie. She had never seen this man before. She insisted that she wasn't his teacher, wished him well, and began to go on her way. But she had a shadow. The man followed behind her, trying to continue his conversation with her as she began to walk away, and even as she mounted her bike. He inundated her with questions about where she was from, what she was doing in Japan, and how long she'd been there. Once more, Lindsay bid him farewell and tried to bike away. But as she biked away, the man followed her. First at a fast walk, then at a jog, and finally at a full sprint. Lindsay wound through Chiba's tight, packed streets as the man chased behind her, still attempting to talk with her as if there was nothing unusual about his behavior. It would become known that the man following her, Tatsuya Ichihashi, had been watching Lindsay for several days. It had taken him multiple train rides, walks down alleyways, and jogs near her house before he gained the courage to speak with her. However, by the time several days have passed, most stalkers believe that they truly know and possibly even love the person they're stalking. Stalkers can become so obsessed with the subject of their fixation that they often blur the lines between reality and fantasy. Some stalkers will believe that they are destined to be with their victim and that nothing can stand in their way, not even the person themselves. Some stalkers, however, find pleasure in toying with their victims. Stalkers often feel a sense of entitlement and possession of the person they follow. By eliciting fear in their victim, they gain their own sick satisfaction and sense of power. It's hard to say precisely what Tatsuya was thinking when he began running after Lindsay on March 20th. He chased her several blocks until he reached her apartment, where she got off her bike and was once more approached by Tatsuya. Tatsuya begged Lindsay to give him English lessons. Lindsay, however, declined, telling him that her schedule was full. At that point, Tatsuya seemed to accept her answer. But before he left, he had a question for Lindsay. It was a question that would change everything. He asked Lindsay if he could come inside for a glass of water. Stalkers are master manipulators. Often they will use guilt to elicit sympathy from the person they're stalking to get their way. In this case, when Tatsuya realized there was no other way to stay close to Lindsay, he played on her kindness to prolong their interaction. This is also a common tactic stalkers use to keep their victims close by. It would not be the last time Tatsuya used this tactic. Lindsay knew that Tatsuya was not going to give up. At the very least, she wanted to offer herself some form of protection that would keep him at bay. She invited Tatsuya in for water so that her two roommates would see his face and be able to identify him. In addition, it was a subtle way of showing Tatsuya that she didn't live alone and that people would notice her absence. Once Lindsay got Tatsuya the glass of water, he changed tactics. He told Lindsay that he desperately needed English lessons and that if she gave them to him, he would pay her the equivalent of $32 an hour. With her roommates having seen him, and his persistence making it clear that he had no intention of backing off, Lindsay agreed to meet Tatsuya at a local cafe to teach him. She wouldn't be in Japan much longer, and the money would allow her to spend more time exploring after her employment ended. Grateful, Tatsuya quickly took a paper and pen and gave Lindsay this gift. Ultimately, this drawing of Lindsay, complete with his phone number and email, would lead police to Tatsuya, but it would be days before that came to light. This is the last known footage of Lindsay Hawker alive. She and Tatsuya waited for their drinks in the cafe where they met for his lesson and chatted. It's worth noting that Lindsay is displaying some nervous behaviors here, stepping away from Tatsuya when he steps close and playing with her hair in a repetitive, self-soothing motion. After their lesson, which lasted around an hour, Tatsuya told Lindsay that he had forgotten his money at home. He convinced Lindsay to join him in a taxi to go get it, and that she could head to work straight from there. When they arrived at Tatsuya's apartment, Lindsay told the cab driver to wait and that she'd be out in a moment to continue to work. But the minutes passed, and passed, and passed. After nearly 10 minutes, the cab driver determined that Lindsay must have changed her plans. He carried on his way, continuing his route in the bustling city. That afternoon, Lindsay didn't arrive at work. Her roommates, who also worked with her, grew concerned. By the time night fell over Tokyo, they knew something was deeply wrong. Back home in the UK, Lindsay's family was panicking. Though she was worlds away, Lindsay kept close contact with her family. She messaged them, emailed them, called them, and video chatted with them almost daily. Her long-term boyfriend hadn't heard from her since just before she left to meet Tatsuya. She had sent him a message over Facebook which read, "Love you lots. Don't worry about the guy who chased me home. It's just crazy Japan. Miss you." Her boyfriend had every reason to worry. Lindsay's friends and family had their fears confirmed when the school Lindsay worked for contacted her mother and father to tell them she hadn't shown up for work. Both her parents and the school contacted local police, who started to investigate in earnest several days after Lindsay's disappearance. Fortunately, they had a lead. Having a name was one thing, but having the email and phone number made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to investigate the wrong person. They rushed to Tatsuya's apartment. When the police knocked on the door, they heard only silence. Neighbors allowed law enforcement to enter their apartments and look into Tatsuya's home from their balconies. Inside, they could see a figure swaying in the shadows. It was clear to them that someone was hiding. They feared that Lindsay was being held captive, which gave them probable cause to enter the apartment. The officers on the scene called for backup, and when several more police officers arrived, they prepared themselves to storm Tatsuya's apartment. But no one was prepared for what happened next. Just as law enforcement was about to break down the door of Tatsuya's apartment, Tatsuya himself opened the door. He was barefoot and wide-eyed, with a rucksack slung over his shoulder. As soon as he saw the police, he sprinted for his life. It was something he would spend the next 2.5 years of his life doing. Police scrambled and grabbed Tatsuya's rucksack, but he managed to squeeze out of their grasp, leaving the backpack behind. He bolted through the winding hallways of the complex and burst out of a back door, disappearing into the bustling streets. Tatsuya had a tragic, horrible reason. He needed to run. But it wasn't until law enforcement stepped on his balcony that they realized why. Tatsuya's bathtub was sitting on his balcony. It was filled with a mix of potting soil and sand, with flower seeds sprinkled on top to make a makeshift garden. But it wasn't a garden of beauty he had planted. It was one of death. Because at the edge of the tub, a ghostly white hand hung out of the soil. Inside, law enforcement uncovered the body of Lindsay Hawker. Her body was marred with bruises that came from both fists and collisions with furniture. Her hands and arms showed signs of defensive wounds, making it clear just how hard she fought for her life. Tatsuya had taken advantage of Lindsay, and in the process broken the cartilage in her neck. It takes 18.8 kilograms or 41 pounds of force to break the cricoid cartilage. Lindsay's death was violent, and even after her brutal death, Tatsuya was not done exerting power over her. When law enforcement discovered Lindsay, she was bound and gagged. Her head had been completely shaven, and her long locks were stuffed into a bag. There are many reasons violent offenders will shave women's heads. Some men do it out of resentment from a perceived rejection. If they believe the woman thinks highly of herself, they may shave her head to embarrass her, or in their mind, teach her a lesson. Sometimes it's simply to exert power over their victim and take away their femininity. It's clear that Tatsuya felt some kind of ownership over Lindsay, and in death, it seems he refused to let that ownership slip out of his fingers. At the time Lindsay's parents were notified of her death, they had been preparing to board a flight to help search for their daughter. Instead, they were about to board a flight to help look for their daughter's killer. Thousands of flyers with Tatsuya's picture were handed out across Japan. Some photos even showed him in various wigs similar to women's wigs that investigators had discovered in his apartment. It was clear from very early on that Tatsuya was in hiding, but at the time, no one knew how good at hiding he would be. Thousands of tips came in during the first few months of the search for Tatsuya. Each one led to a dead end. Soon, police implied that Tatsuya may have left the country or ended his own life. But Lindsay's loving family wasn't standing for that. They felt that the Japanese police were trying to pretend that Tatsuya no longer existed to sweep Lindsay's murder and their own failures under the rug. Tatsuya's mother and father began constant news conferences and trips to Japan, where they handed out flyers and made public appeals for their daughter's safe return.
And help us get justice for this girl that she so rightly deserves.
But we're a strong family and we're going to see this through to the end. All we want is justice for Lindsay.
Lindsay's parents did see it through until the end. At one point, her father contacted Yakuza members and paid them to hunt down Tatsuya. The Hawkers left absolutely no stone unturned, and it's safe to say that without their involvement, Tatsuya could still be walking free amongst us. For quite some time, Tatsuya wandered around Tokyo. After seeing a wanted poster of himself with prominent moles on his cheek, he took a box cutter into a public restroom and removed the moles himself. To him, the bloody mess and pain were worth his freedom. He made his way up to Aomori, the northernmost prefecture on Japan's main island. All the while, he wore masks, hats, and hoods to conceal his identity. But that wasn't the only thing he did. In addition to removing his moles, Tatsuya used a needle and thread to tighten the bridge of his nose in a makeshift plastic surgery. One day, he took scissors to his bottom lip to change the shape and look even less like the pictures, posters, and cardboard cutouts that were widely circulating of him. He claimed that cutting his lip was so painful that he had to stop and finish the job a few days later in a public restroom in Aomori. From there, Tatsuya continued his life on the run. He lived in an abandoned bunker on the remote island of Oha for several days before he went to Osaka, where he began working for a construction company under a false name. He used the identity of a dead man, Kosuke Inoue, and avoided being in photos or spending any excess time with his co-workers. Once he had saved $1 million yen, he began visiting licensed plastic surgeons to further change his appearance. But it was in that attempt to conceal his identity that Tatsuya made his biggest mistake. Surgeons at one of the facilities noted the strange marks on Tatsuya's face where he had removed his moles. They convinced Tatsuya to take before and after photos of the procedure he had done to narrow his nose, and then sent the photos to law enforcement. Tatsuya's new look was plastered all over Japan in just a few days. His mother and father both made public pleas to him. His father stated, "You have committed a crime. You must be brought to justice. I want you to atone for what you did." Tatsuya's attempts at atonement were not what his father nor the public had in mind. He reportedly went to several shrines and temples in Shinkoku to ask for forgiveness and plead for Lindsay to come back to life. Soon after the new photos were released, Tatsuya attempted to flee to Okinawa. At the ferry, a worker recognized him and called the police. Law enforcement stormed the ferry terminal. An officer approached Tatsuya and asked him his name, and Tatsuya used his real name for the first time in nearly 3 years. Just like that, Tatsuya was taken into custody for abandoning a body.